My topic is mind reading, the process of identifying mental states and actions as the mental states and actions of particular subjects, yourself or another. Very simple illustration, classic illustration. You're asked, which box will Maxi look in? Which box will Maxi look in? And you're a mind reader. So what you do is you think to yourself, well, Maxi wants his chocolate. He believes his chocolate is in the blue box. Therefore, Maxi will look in the blue box. Very good. Nice prediction. Suppose you weren't a mind reader. You might reason as follows. Chocolate is intrinsically good. And this is true. Maxi's chocolate is in the red box. This is also true. And so you might conclude very reasonably that Maxi will look in the red box. Now, although we can't always identify whether or not someone is attributing beliefs or making inferences from facts, there are these situations where the beliefs are false and the action predictions will differ depending on whether you're mind reading or not mind reading. So it's partly for this reason that we focus on the case of belief, even though of course we don't think that mind reading is just about beliefs. Also, surely there are desires, there are emotions and many other aspects of people's mental lives that matter. So this is mind reading, the topic of the talk today. And I've got two ideas. One is that I want to give you the core part of an argument for a dual process theory of mind reading. And the other thing I want to do is to share with you some new work and very tentative idea that in one of the mind reading processes, there may be a role for motor processes, processes which are involved in control of action. So that's the idea. Let me start very simple. Here's my dual process theory as a very simple causal model. So here's a variable response 1, and this variable represents whether or not a response occurs, and if so, what it is. So this might be a verbal response where you say to me, Maxi will look in the blue cupboard. Now, process 1 is another variable, and that represents whether or not a particular mind reading process occurs, and if so, what its output is. And I'm using the arrows to indicate causal relations between the variables. Now, my mind reading process, I suppose, is influenced by a variety of contextual factors. So what instructions you might be given, what the content of the belief or other mental state you're attributing is, and so on. So these are my contextual variables here. And just informally, I'm using thicker and thinner lines to indicate informally that one might have a stronger or a weaker effect on another variable. So what's a dual process theory of mind reading? It's just one where there are two or more of these processes. So any response that you make which involves mind reading will be a function of at least two mind reading processes. And of course, the interesting thing for us is that if we're really lucky, we may find responses which are dominated by different processes. So it might well be that in response to a single scenario, I can measure both a proactive eye gaze and an explicit verbal response, and those two responses could be dominated by different processes, and so I could dissociate them. That's the idea. So here's the thought. A dual process theory of mind reading says that there are two or more mind reading processes which are distinct in the sense that the conditions which influence whether they occur and which outputs they generate do not completely overlap. On top of that, I'm going to say that one process makes fewer demands on scarce cognitive resources than the other, so things like working memory, attention, inhibitory control. And I'm going to follow the convention of calling processes which make fewer demands fast, even though, of course, we're not measuring time in any of these experiments in that way. We're not measuring how long the processes take. So we've got faster processes and slower processes. Very simple. Now you say to me, look, Steve, your dual process theory of mind reading says almost nothing, right? It says almost nothing. And that's the point. So this is quite different from your ordinary dual process theories, which involve, claims about consciousness and attention and so on. The idea here is to strip it right down in order to avoid making a parlay bet, a bet which involves multiple, perhaps unconnected, different conjectures. So we take this as the core part and then we add conjectures that we can test separately. This is the idea. Now, Steve, suppose you had this dual process theory of mind reading. What kind of things would you expect? Well, one thing you'd expect is that if you vary, for example, the task instructions, you might differentially affect different mind reading processes. And so if you're lucky, you might differentially affect different responses. So for example, if we're looking at a proactive gaze response and a verbal response or a push button to indicate where someone will look, we would expect that the verbal response will change quite a lot if we tell people to tell us where the ball is versus where the belief is. That'll make quite a big difference to whether or not the verbal response indicates belief tracking, but it will make a very small difference to the proactive eye gaze. So that difference is helpful for us. That's the kind of evidence that we would expect manipulating instructions to support such a dual process theory. Or we might think, what we'll do is change the content of the task, and we might have a theory, I'll introduce that in a second, that says one of these processes is totally fine with almost any belief you throw at it, whereas another process is great with beliefs about location and colour, shape and size, but messes up with beliefs that essentially involve mistakes about numerical identity. So in that case, what we might find is that when we switch to a belief about numerical identity, the proactive gaze no longer seems to be tracking belief at all. The accuracy drops right off. And now we're happy because it looks like by changing different contextual factors, we can selectively change how strongly different responses track belief. So that looks good. We can also do things like increase time pressure and cognitive load. Now, the opponents of dual process theories often caricature the theory by saying that we think there's a process that's just immune to cognitive load, but that's not true, of course. What we think is that as you increase cognitive load, you're going to have different effects on the processes. One will be more susceptible than the other, and so you'll see different changes in those responses, different ways of them breaking down. Now, so far here, we've been thinking about this in a way that's much too simple. We've been thinking that we can isolate responses where different responses are linked to different processes. Much too simple, because not only are any response consequence of multiple processes, but also what we'd expect is that as we change contextual factors, we can change how strongly one process dominates a response. So to illustrate this idea, this is an experiment that hasn't been done for the case of mind reading, but we do have it for perspective taking. We might take an experiment in which you're given instructions, please keep track of the ball. So here we would nearly always see that people are correct about the location of the ball, and therefore that they're ignoring an agent's belief, just as they're supposed to. What we'd hope to see, though, is that you can increase time pressure or cognitive load, or sometimes both, and those responses which initially were very good at tracking the ball suddenly became worse at tracking the ball and better at tracking the false belief. We'd see an increase in accuracy there. And we'd say, from our dual process theory point of view, what's happening here is that the response, that button press response, was dominated by a slower process and is now being more dominated by a faster process. You're seeing more of the faster process there. That's the idea. So very simple dual process theory says almost nothing, just that we've got these two or more processes that are differentially affected by contextual factors, and that those changes in the contextual factors can change how the processes influence the responses in predictable ways. Now, this is a very generic idea, and if you look across different domains, for example, reasoning and inference is perhaps the most famous, but there are also dual process theories of numerical cognition or ethical cognition. Across all of these domains, you might have almost the same theory. So what we've got so far is generic, just a kind of schematic dual process theory. What we need then is to fill it out with some conjectures that will explain and allow us to make predictions about how the contextual factors will affect the processes. And those conjectures can be about the nature of the processes themselves, come to that in a minute, or first they can be about the kind of models which the processes involve. A model is just a way that the world could be. So a model is something that you would often describe using a theory or a set of axioms, but the model itself isn't a theory or an axiom. In thinking about models, we're after this. You've got this mind reading process, and the mind reading process depends on the mental world being in some particular way. But how the process depends on the world being might be quite different from how the world actually is, right? That's very natural to think about in the case of physical cognition. So if you think in terms of physical cognition, you know that very often people's model of the physical is something quite different from the true physical. It ignores factors like gravity and air resistance, which are fairly constant in ordinary life. So likewise with mind reading, we're going to expect that our processes involve some kind of model of the mental, and that might be different from how the mental really is. Now, to get to a conjecture about models, we have to ask the question, well, look, how could there be mind reading processes which are fast? And what we know is that any broadly information processing system will make a trade-off between speed and accuracy within limits. As you want to get faster, you're going to have to use a less accurate model of the world, and conversely. So for that reason, it seems likely that where we have faster processes, they'll be using simpler models of the mental. They'll be using simpler models. So what we want by way of a conjecture is one that says, look, a faster process involves this simple model, and a slower process involves this more elaborate model, and then we can use that difference to make predictions. So the conjecture that I'm offering you is that fast mind reading processes rely on minimal models of the mental. And then you're like, Steve, what's a minimal model of the mental? Well, this is something that I constructed with Ian Appley, and we published this, so I won't spend a long time on this. Well, I'm very happy to share the reference or the short version of this if you'd like to later. And the idea is very simple. We introduce a mental state called registration, which is a relation between you, an object, and initially a location, and later it can include other things like shape. And we describe some principles, and if you represent registrations and you follow our principles, then you will be able to keep track of what other people believe by representing these registrations. So by construction, we have a minimal model of the mental. That allows us to make some predictions. We can predict that fast mind reading is subject to the signature limits of those minimal models, where a signature limit is a prediction that you can derive from the model, which is both false and not a prediction that you can generate from any of the other models under consideration. So signature limits are kind of signatures that you're using a particular model. Now, in the case of the minimal model of minds and actions, that's based on the use of relations between agents and objects and other things. It's based on the use of relations. So here's the thing, if you've got something like Superman, when Lois is standing to the left of Superman, she's in that relation to Superman. She's also standing to the left of Clark Kent, right? So insofar as we're thinking about relations, there's no possibility of making mistakes about numerical identity. And that's the limit of minimal models of minds and actions. So famously in the cartoons and then the film, Superman and Clark Kent are one and the same individual, and Lois Lane believes that they're two distinct individuals. So she has a false belief that essentially involves numerical identity. Her mental world is expanded relative to the real world because in her mental world there are two things, whereas in reality there are only one. So we have a case of expansion here with Lois. I really want to get away from the Superman, and I keep trying different bits of popular culture, and it turns out that it's actually only Superman that people get, and I've never met anybody who doesn't get the Superman reference. So if there's anybody here who's like, who's this Superman Clark Kent thing, let me know, I'll be super happy. Anyway, so you get the idea. So you and I, we can read the comics, we can watch the film, it all makes sense to us because we're able to keep track of Lois's false belief about Superman and Clark Kent being two, where really they're one. But if you were using the minimal model of minds and actions, you should fail this test. You should not be able to make sense of the film or the comic. You wouldn't see the attraction of it at all. There's our signature limit. Now, what about processes? So in a second, I'll show you an experiment to test the processes, but I want to the models. I'll show you an experiment to test that prediction. But before I get there, I want to introduce the conjecture about processes, and just to save time, put the two things together in a single paradigm. So here's a conjecture. The fast mind reading processes are more automatic than the slow mind reading processes, where by automatic I mean sensitive to instructions, your current intention, your task and your desires. So the idea is that as you change your instructions or your intentions, that will have a greater effect on the slow than on the fast processes. So that allows us to predict that fast mind reading processes will be less sensitive to task instructions. Very good. Okay, Steve, you fleshed out the dual process theory. You've got some predictions. How are we going to test them? Well, actually, there's kind of a bit more than a decade of attempts to test these, and it's a little bit controversial, and there's lots of great work that I'm skipping over here. So sorry to the people whose work I'm skipping over. I just want to show you one experiment because this illustrates both conjectures taken together. So in this experiment, what you see is a video which involves Jason sitting opposite you. So this is your perspective. Here's Jason sitting opposite you, and you're also seeing two balls, a red ball and a blue ball. Now, just across from the balls are two screens, and the balls are going to move between the two screens so that manifestly neither you nor Jason can see them. So in this particular video, what's going to happen is that the two balls will go behind the screens, off they go. While Jason's still there, the blue ball comes out. Now Jason leaves, and while he's left, this is really sneaky, the red ball comes out, very sneaky, the blue ball goes back again. So when Jason comes back again, he's in a situation where he's expecting, he's the agent A, the red ball, and you as the participant P are expecting the blue ball to appear. Your task is very simple. 64 times in a row, your task is always to press one button if you see the red ball and a different button if you see the blue ball. One button if you see the red ball, a different button if you see the blue ball. So here, because you're expecting the blue ball, when you see the blue ball, of course, you'll be faster than if you were expecting the red ball, if we tricked you. The interesting question we have here, though, is does what Jason believes make a difference? Would you be faster in a situation where Jason, like you, expected the blue ball versus this situation where Jason expects the red ball? So, of course, what we do is we take this scenario that I just showed you. You have a true belief, Jason has a false belief, P plus A minus, and compare that with a situation where Jason's belief is true. And the prediction here is that your response will be faster when Jason has a true belief than when he has a false belief, even though Jason's belief is completely irrelevant to your task and you're never asked about it at all. So if we find that, we'd be tempted to think that there's some degree of automaticity here because we've got task irrelevant and instruction irrelevant belief tracking going on. And of course, we would also want to do the converse thing. So we'd want to have a situation where you're expecting a red ball, but you see a blue ball. And then Jason's belief can either be false, he's expecting a red ball as well, or true, he's expecting a blue ball. So the findings are very nice, and this is a much replicated finding. You're significantly slower when Jason has a false belief compared to a true belief, regardless of whether your belief is true, as in this pair, or when your belief is false, as in this second pair here. You're still faster when Jason's belief is true than when Jason's belief is false. So that's nice. Here's the second thing we can do with this paradigm. We can get rid of our two balls, get rid of our balls, and replace them with a kind of Superman Clark Kent figure. So this is a low budget film, so we didn't actually have a Superman Clark Kent figure to hand. Catherine and Jason rather created a robot which is blue on one side and red on the other, and there's a backstory which leads you to think that from Jason's point of view, robots are either blue or either red, so Jason will make a mistake about numerical identity. So our dual process prediction here is that when we switch from balls to the robot, the Superman Clark Kent numerical identity mistake, we're no longer going to see an effect of Jason's belief on your response times, and that's exactly what we see. So Jason's belief no longer makes a difference at all. Of course, your own expectations do, so you're still slower when you have a false expectation than a true expectation, but Jason's expectations are no longer making a measurable difference at all. So here are two things that we try to put together, and I don't say this is the most convincing piece of evidence taken in isolation, just try to illustrate the two conjectures. On the one hand, even though the instructions don't specify Jason at all, there's no reason why you would be tracking him. It seems like Jason's beliefs about the colour of the ball are making a difference to your response time, but that effect goes away in a situation where we're no longer thinking about the colour or location of an object, but instead of thinking about numerical identity. So the suggestion is that we can confirm both of those predictions. Now, of course, there are also people who say, look, I've got evidence that shows some of these predictions are false. And I think that's right. And there are also difficulties about replication. So it's certainly not cut and dried, but there's some evidence for both predictions. Last thing. We then went on and asked the question, well, look, why is it that another person's false belief should have an effect on reaction times? Why is it that Jason's belief should sort of cause you to anticipate another's action? And we were inspired by some research from Constantini and colleagues, where they found that where an object that you're presented with has an irrelevant action potential, so for example this cup, you could grasp it using the handle with the right hand, responses using the right hand tend to be faster than responses using the left hand, but that effect goes away when the cup is placed out of reach, in this case behind a translucent screen. So they found faster response times for actions where the handle position and the hand were congruent than incongruent, but that difference went away if they make the cup no longer reachable by putting it behind a screen. Also works if you put it further away. What Constantini also found in a later experiment is that you can get much the same effect for somebody else's action potentials. So they're always showing people a static display, the static three-dimensional display, nothing moves, but still when the cup is within the avatar's reaching space, whether the avatar would use the right hand or the left hand, people are responding faster with the corresponding hand of their own, but when it's unreachable by the avatar, that mug, they're not doing so. So the thought here is that the processes involved in preparation and control of action, the motor processes, are somehow also involved in anticipating others' possible actions. So here's a really wild thought. Why is it that other people's false beliefs have an effect on your reaction times? Well, maybe what's happening here is that those anticipations of their action are influenced by the fast mind reading processes that are taking track of their belief. So somehow that information about belief is somehow feeding into the motor processes that anticipate action. Now, if that's right, then constraining other people's action possibilities ought to reduce the effects of the false belief on their reaction times. So to test that, what we did was use Jason in some videos again. And in this case, we wanted to emphasize the action aspect. So we got Jason to place a single object now behind a screen. We did do foot or hand, but that didn't make any difference. So let's skip that. And then just as before, Jason ends up either with a true belief or a false belief about whether the object is behind the screen. And then Jason, at the very end of this, Jason returns to the scene, and your job is just to press the spacebar if the object's present and otherwise not do it. So very simple object detection task. You're never asked about Jason, you're always just said, please press the spacebar when you see the ball as quickly as you can. Our main comparison was between the very standard condition where Jason appears just as Jason, a second condition where Jason is mummified, so he's completely wrapped up in a kind of massive blanket, so he's unable to move his arms at all, or a control condition where Jason's wearing a loose sheet and it's kind of flapping around in the video, so we tried to make it as distracting as possible in order to control for this. So he's got this very flappy, loose sheet. And what we found was nice. So we first of all replicated the idea that we had from before. Jason's beliefs, although always irrelevant, make you faster to respond when Jason's correct than when he's incorrect, both when your belief is true and also when your belief is false. Both of those differences are significant. We also found the same thing with a loose sheet. So Jason wearing a loose sheet didn't change the pattern of effects that we observed at all. But when we bodily constrained Jason in that final phase, the effect went away. There was no significant difference that Jason's belief made. And because everybody's doing it these days, we thought, we should do some Bayesian analysis as well. So same data, Bayesian analysis, strong evidence for an effect of belief in both the free agent and the loose sheet version, and anecdotal evidence for there being no effect of Jason's belief in the constrained agent version. So it's not, of course, it's not our dream result where we would get strong evidence in every case, but at least it's taking us in the right direction there. It's suggestive. So here's my thought, very simple. This is a talk about mind reading, dual process theories, and the idea that if we accept that there are faster and slower mind reading processes, there might just be a role connecting those mind reading processes that are fast with the motor processes. It might be, for example, that somehow information from mind reading processes is feeding into the motor processes and so influencing your ability to anticipate others' actions. And that would be exciting from the point of view of mind reading, because it would be telling us that mind reading somehow is connected up with these processes that allow us both to control our own actions and to track others' actions. And it would be exciting from the point of view of people who are interested in the role of these motor processes in social cognition, because it would suggest that those motor processes are not involved just in simulating actions, but also in some way connected to processes involved in simulating others' minds. Thank you very much.